This is the story of a terror that no one survived to tell, a nightmare that began on an ordinary day. The road to Oakhaven was not on any map Elias Thorne owned. It was a phantom limb of the state highway system, a place you had to know was there to even begin to look for it. His global positioning system had surrendered an hour ago, its screen displaying a single placid blue arrow floating in a sea of nameless green. He was navigating by a set of hand-drawn directions scribbled on a bar napkin, obtained from a weary-eyed gas station attendant who had looked at him with something between pity and contempt. "Folks who go looking for Oakhaven usually have a reason," the man had said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Just make sure it is a good one." Elias believed his was. He was a folklore archivist, a collector of whispers and forgotten tales. His life's work was to chart the dying myths of rural America before they faded completely into the white noise of modernity. The legend of Oakhaven's Silent Children was a particularly rare specimen, a story that had never seemed to travel beyond the valley that cradled the town. There were no mentions of it online, no scholarly articles, no references in the state's historical archives. It existed only in hearsay, a ghost of a story passed down through a handful of families who had long since moved away. They spoke of a town frozen in time, a place where the woods held a sorrow so deep it had become malevolent. They spoke of children who vanished without a sound, and of the faint whispering voices that could still be heard in the trees on moonless nights. It was exactly the kind of academic obscurity that built a career like his. The car, a practical sedan utterly unsuited for the journey, groaned as the pavement finally gave way to a packed dirt road. Towering, ancient oaks and pines formed a dense canopy overhead, swallowing the afternoon sun and plunging the path into a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something vaguely metallic and unwelcoming. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He was a man of logic, of documented facts and verifiable sources. He dealt in stories, yes, but as artifacts, not as realities. Yet, the profound, oppressive isolation of this road was beginning to fray the edges of his professional detachment. The silence was the first thing that felt truly wrong. It was not the peaceful quiet of the countryside. It was a weighted, watchful silence. There were no birds, no insects, just the crunch of gravel under his tires and the strained hum of the engine. He rounded a sharp bend and slammed on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was a deer. It was a large buck, its antlers like a thorny crown, but its posture was unnatural. It stood perfectly still, its head cocked at an odd angle, its dark eyes fixed on him. It was not fear he saw in its gaze, but a strange, unnerving emptiness. He honked the horn. The deer did not flinch. It simply stood there, a silent, taxidermied sentinel. Elias felt a prickle of genuine fear, an instinctual alarm that had nothing to do with folklore. He put the car in reverse, planning to back up and give it a wider berth. But then, as if moved by some unheard command, the deer took one slow, deliberate step to the side and vanished into the impenetrable woods. It did not bound away. It was there, and then it was gone. Shaken, Elias put the car back in drive and continued on. The image of those vacant eyes burned into his mind. He saw the first sign of the town a few miles later, a weathered, hand-carved wooden sign that simply read, Oakhaven. The letters were faded, covered in a creeping green moss. Beyond it, the trees thinned, revealing a cluster of buildings huddled in the low slung valley. Mist clung to the ground, weaving between the structures like a restless spirit. The town was a study in decay. The buildings were old, their wooden frames sagging, their paint peeled away by years of harsh winters and humid summers. Gabled roofs were patched with mismatched shingles, and porches listed like sinking ships. There were no clean lines, no bright colours, just the muted palette of grey wood, dark earth, and the ever-present green of the encroaching forest. As he drove down what he assumed was the main street, he saw a few people. An old man on a porch, slowly rocking in a chair, his face a road map of wrinkles. A woman sweeping her front steps with a handmade broom, her movements listless and automatic. They all stopped what they were doing as his car rolled past. They watched him, their faces impassive, their eyes holding a shared, hollow expression he could not decipher. It was the same emptiness he had seen in the deer. No one waved, no one smiled. When he passed, they did not resume their activities immediately, but continued to stare at the empty space where his car had been. It felt less like a town and more like a wake. The inn was the largest building on the street, a 2-story structure with a faded sign that read, The Weary Dragon. The name was oddly whimsical for such a grim place. He parked the car and stepped out, the damp, cool air immediately seeping into his clothes. The heavy silence pressed in on him again. He could hear his own footsteps on the gravel with unnerving clarity. The front door creaked open into a dimly lit common room that smelled of wood smoke, dust, and old beer. A stone fireplace, cold and black, dominated one wall. A few rickety tables and chairs were scattered across the worn wooden floorboards. Behind a long dark wood bar stood a woman. She was old, with thin white hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes the colour of a stormy sky. "Can I help you?" Her voice was thin and brittle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I am looking for a room," Elias said, trying to sound cheerful and failing. "I called ahead a few weeks ago. The name is Thorne, Elias Thorne." The woman's expression did not change. She blinked slowly, her gaze lingering on him as if she were measuring him for a coffin. "Martha, I am the one you spoke to." She reached under the counter and produced a heavy, ornate iron key. "Room 4. Top of the stairs, end of the hall. $10 a night. Cash. In advance." Elias pulled out his wallet and handed her a 50. "I will be here for at least 5 nights. She took the bill without a word, her long, bony fingers making the transaction feel like some ancient, solemn ritual. She gave him no change. "Dinner is at 6. If you are not down by then, I do not save any. Breakfast is at 7. "Same rule." She paused, her gaze flicking towards the window and the gloomy street beyond. "We lock the doors at sundown. Do not be outside after dark. The woods, they are not safe." "I am just here for research," Elias explained, feeling a need to justify his presence. "I study local history, folklore, I was hoping to learn more about the silent children. The moment the words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the room, already frigid, dropped several more degrees. Martha's hand, which had been wiping the counter with a rag, went still. The friendly innkeeper facade, thin as it was, vanished completely. She looked at him now with an expression of profound weariness, of a deep and abiding sorrow. "There is nothing to learn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some stories are best left buried. You are a fool for coming here to dig them up." She turned her back on him then, a clear dismissal. Elias took the key and headed for the stairs. The wood groaned under his weight, each step a complaint. The hallway upstairs was long and narrow, lined with doors that all looked identical. A threadbare runner muffled his footsteps. The air was stale, thick with the smell of disuse. He found room 4 at the very end. The key scraped in the lock, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet. The room was Spartan. A single bed with a lumpy mattress and a patchwork quilt. A small wooden desk and a chair. A rickety wardrobe and a single window that looked out not over the town, but directly into the dense, dark woods that bordered the back of the inn. The trees were so close he felt he could reach out and touch their gnarled bark. He noticed a small, peculiar carving on the headboard of the bed. It was a circle with a vertical line running through it, like a stylized eye that had been closed. He ran his fingers over it. The wood was worn smooth, as if countless other hands had traced the same symbol over the years. He spent the next hour unpacking his small suitcase and setting up his research equipment on the desk, a laptop, a digital audio recorder, and a stack of notebooks. He tried to work, to organize his notes on the meager information he had, but his focus was shot. The silence of the room, of the entire town, was unnerving. He kept glancing at the window, at the wall of trees that seemed to press in against the glass. He felt watched. It was an irrational feeling, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by a creepy town and a cryptic innkeeper, but he could not shake it. He decided a walk might clear his head. He needed to visit the town hall to see if their municipal records held any clues the state archives had missed. He went back downstairs. The common room was empty. Martha was gone. He stepped outside into the grey, misty afternoon. The town was just as quiet as before. He walked down the centre of the street, his footsteps echoing strangely. He passed a general store, its windows dark and grimy. He passed what looked like a church, its steeple leaning at a precarious angle. He saw no children, not a single one. There were no toys in the yards, no bikes propped against fences, no sound of laughter or play. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the damp air. The town hall was a squat stone building that looked more like a mausoleum. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp paper and ozone. A single man sat behind a high counter, his head bent over a large leather-bound ledger. He was a gaunt man with a pale, sallow complexion and thin, greasy hair combed over a balding scalp. He looked up as Elias entered, his eyes small and suspicious. "Help you?" His voice was reedy. "Yes, I hope so. My name is Elias Thorne. I am a historian." I am researching the history of this region, and I was hoping I could take a look at your town's archives, birth and death records, town meeting minutes, anything from the late 19th century. The clerk, whose nameplate identified him as Gable, stared at him for a long moment. Do not get many historians out this way. It is a fascinating area, Elias said, trying his best to be charming. Gable did not seem charmed. He sighed, a long, rattling exhalation of breath, and slowly pushed himself up from his stool. Records are in the back, but they are not in good shape. We had a fire, must be 50 years ago now. Damaged a lot of the older books. He led Elias through a door into a small, windowless room filled with tall metal shelves. The shelves were crammed with dusty, disorganized stacks of books and boxes. The smell of mildew was overpowering. Here you go, Gable said, gesturing vaguely at the mess. Knock yourself out. Just do not make a bigger mess than it already is, and I am locking up at 5 on the dot. He turned and left, closing the door behind him, and leaving Elias in the dim light of a single buzzing fluorescent bulb. Elias spent the next 2 hours digging through the archives, his initial academic excitement slowly souring into frustration and then into a gnawing suspicion. Gable had not been lying. The records were a disaster, but the damage was not random. He found ledgers for births and deaths, their pages brittle and yellowed with age. He looked for the years between 1880 and 1900, the period when the legend of the Silent Children was said to have originated, and it was precisely those pages that were missing. In some books they had been cleanly cut out with a sharp blade, in others they had been torn out, leaving ragged, telltale stubs. He found town council minutes where entire meetings were blacked out with thick, dark ink. It was not the work of a fire. It was deliberate. Someone had carefully, methodically, and brutally expunged a period of this town's history. He felt a growing sense of unease. This was no longer just about a forgotten piece of folklore. This was a cover-up. The people of this town were not just quiet, they were hiding something. He found an old property map from the early 1900s. It showed the town layout, the surrounding farms, the winding path of a creek, and deep in the woods, not far from the town, was a small square building labelled simply the schoolhouse. He folded the map and slipped it into his jacket pocket. By the time Gable knocked sharply on the door to tell him it was 5 o'clock, Elias was covered in dust, and his mind was reeling. He had found nothing about the children, but the absence of information was more telling than any written account could have been. He walked back to the inn as the sun began to set, painting the ever-present mist in hues of orange and purple. The gloom of the town seemed to deepen with the approaching night. Street lamps, old-fashioned gas-style fixtures, flickered on one by one, casting pools of weak, yellow light that seemed only to make the shadows deeper and more menacing. Back in his room, he sat at the desk, the stolen map spread out before him. The schoolhouse. That had to be a key. He ate the dinner Martha had left for him on a tray outside his door, a bland, lukewarm stew and a piece of stale bread, without tasting it. As darkness fell completely, The woods outside his window became a solid wall of impenetrable black. And then he heard it. It started so faintly. He thought he was imagining it. A trick of the wind in the eaves of the old inn. It was a whisper, a soft, sibilant sound, like the rustle of silk. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floorboards, from the glass of the window pane. It was too faint to make out any words, but it had a distinct cadence, a rhythmic rise and fall that was horribly, unsettlingly human. He stood up and pressed his ear against the wall. The whispering grew slightly louder. It was not one voice. It was many, a chorus of faint, dry whispers, overlapping and intertwining. He told himself it was the wind, it was the old building settling, it was his own mind, primed by the spooky atmosphere and the unnerving discoveries of the day. He was a rational man, a scholar. He did not believe in ghosts. He backed away from the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He went to the window, intending to close the curtains to block out the oppressive darkness of the forest, and that is when he saw it. Sitting on the outer windowsill, perfectly centered, was a small, crude doll. It was carved from a single piece of wood, its arms and legs little more than twigs, its face a smooth, featureless oval, with 2 dots for eyes and a thin, curved line for a smile. It was identical to the dolls he had seen hanging in the woods on his drive-in. His blood ran cold. He knew, with an absolute and terrifying certainty, that it had not been there when he had first entered the room. The window was locked from the inside. His room was on the 2nd floor. He stared at the doll, at its simple painted smile that seemed to be mocking him. The whispering in the walls grew louder, the sound of 100 hushed voices all speaking at once, their words just on the edge of comprehension. He could almost make out a single repeated sound, a soft rhythmic chant. He backed away from the window, his gaze locked on the small wooden figure. He fumbled for the deadbolt on his door and threw it. The sound of the metal bolts sliding home unnaturally loud in the whispering room. He leaned his back against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition. It was a crushing certainty. He was a specimen under a microscope. He was an intruder in a place that did not want him, a place with a terrible secret it would do anything to protect. The whispers continued their soft, insistent chorus around him, and outside, in the suffocating darkness of Oakhaven, he knew that the forest was listening. Sleep did not come. Elias Thorne spent the night pressed into a corner of the room, the wooden chair wedged under the doorknob, his back against the cold plaster of the walls. He was a man who had built his life on the bedrock of reason, but the foundations were crumbling. He had tried for the first few agonizing hours to rationalize. The whispers were the wind, he told himself, funneling through a crack in the window frame, a quirk of the old building's acoustics. The doll was a prank, a tasteless welcome from the insular locals to the city slicker who had come to pry into their affairs. Perhaps Martha, the innkeeper, had a spare key. She could have slipped in while he was at the town hall and placed it there, a piece of macabre local theatre. But the logic was thin, a threadbare blanket against the encroaching cold of raw, primal fear. The whispers were too varied, too rhythmic. They were not the mindless howl of the wind. They were a concert of hushed, secret voices, And the doll. The window had been locked from the inside. He had checked it himself when he had first entered the room. The latch was old and rusted, but it was secure. There was no way to open it from the outside without breaking the glass. He sat in the dark, listening. The whispering chorus rose and fell, a tide of sound that seemed to wash against the very walls of the inn. At times it was a low, sibilant murmur, like sand scouring bone. At others it rose in pitch, becoming a high, thin keen that scraped at the edges of his hearing, the sound of distant, unimaginable grief. He tried to pick out words, to find some pattern or meaning in the sound, but it was a language of pure atmosphere, a vocabulary of dread. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if the sounds were crawling inside his skull, trying to root out his sanity and plant something terrible in its place. He clutched his digital recorder, his academic instincts a pathetic shield against the encroaching dark. He should be documenting this, analyzing it. Instead, he could only sit, paralyzed, a small, frightened animal trapped in a cage of whispering walls. Sometime before dawn, the whispers faded. They did not stop abruptly, but receded slowly, like a tide going out, leaving behind a silence that was somehow heavier and more menacing than the sound it had replaced. Exhaustion finally overtook him, and he slumped into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep that offered no rest, only a series of fractured, terrifying images, a deer with hollow eyes, a room full of faceless wooden dolls, a schoolhouse deep in a dark, silent wood. He awoke with a jolt to the grey light of morning filtering through the window. For a moment, the normality of daylight was a comfort. Then he remembered. He scrambled to the window, his heart pounding. The doll was gone. The windowsill was bare, beaded with the morning dew. There was no sign it had ever been there. He stared, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was this the result of stress, of a long drive and a town designed to unsettle? He felt a wave of dizzying uncertainty. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe he was a fool for coming here. He unwedged the chair from the door and opened it cautiously. A tray with a bowl of lumpy oatmeal and a cup of black coffee sat on the floor. He had no appetite, but he forced himself to drink the coffee. He needed his wits about him. He was a researcher, an archivist. He dealt in facts. The destroyed records were a fact. The map was a fact. He had to hold on to that. He would not be driven out by ghost stories and phantom dolls. His resolve hardened. He needed more information, and he would not get it from the hostile innkeeper or the secretive town clerk. He decided to try the general store he had passed yesterday. It was the only other commercial establishment he had seen. Perhaps a bit of casual conversation, a simple purchase, could yield something. The store was even darker and more cluttered than he had expected. Shelves bowed under the weight of canned goods, dusty jars, and strange handmade tools whose purpose he could not guess. The air was thick with the smells of sawdust, coffee beans, and mothballs. An old man stood behind the counter, methodically polishing a shotgun with an oily rag. He was built like a barrel, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak. He glanced up as Elias entered, his eyes, small and buried in fleshy sockets, showing a flicker of something that was not quite surprise, but a weary, resigned curiosity. "Morning," Elias said, his voice sounding too loud in the cramped space. The man grunted in reply, not stopping his work on the gun. "I am just passing through," Elias lied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Staying at the inn. I need a few things. Some bottled water, maybe a map of the area, if you have one." The man set the gun down and gestured with a thick thumb towards a cooler in the back. "Got water. Do not have maps. Nobody who lives here needs one. Nobody who does not live here has any business being here." Elias retrieved 2 bottles of water and set them on the counter. He decided to take a direct approach. "I am actually a writer, doing a piece on forgotten towns in this part of the state. Oakhaven has a unique history, does it?" The storekeeper picked up the shotgun again. "History is just things that are over and done with. Best to leave it that way." "I heard a story once," Elias pressed, "about some children a long time ago. They called them the Silent Children." The polishing stopped. The old man's hands went completely still. He slowly, deliberately, placed the shotgun on the counter, its barrel pointing vaguely in Elias's direction. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, Elias saw a raw, powerful emotion in the man's eyes. Fear. It was a deep, ancient fear, a terror that had been worn into the man's soul over a lifetime. "You get in your car," the man said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You drive back up that road you came down. You do not stop. You do not look back. You forget you ever heard the name of this town. You forget you ever heard that name." "Why?" Elias asked, his own fear warring with his academic curiosity. "What happened to them?" "They were taken," the man whispered, his eyes darting towards the front window, towards the dark line of the woods that ringed the town. The woods took them, and it will take anyone else who goes looking. It is hungry, it always is." He snatched the money Elias had placed on the counter and shoved the water bottles towards him. "Now get out. I will not tell you again." Elias left the store, the man's fearful words echoing in his ears. The woods took them. The phrase was straight out of a fairy tale, but the terror in the man's eyes had been real. He walked back towards the inn, his mind made up. He could not leave. Not now. This was not just a local legend. It was a town-wide trauma, a wound that had never healed, and the schoolhouse was at the heart of it. He went to his car and retrieved a flashlight and a compass from his emergency kit. He looked at the hand-drawn map from the archives. The schoolhouse was marked about 2 miles north of the town, deep in the forest. There was no trail indicated. He would have to make his own way. He told himself he would just take a look from a distance. He would get the lay of the land. He would document the location. He was a researcher, not an adventurer. Getting into the woods was easier than he expected. Behind the inn, the manicured pretense of the town gave way almost immediately to the wild, untamed forest. The moment he stepped under the canopy of the trees, the world changed. The temperature dropped. The air grew still and heavy. The weak morning sun was blotted out, plunging the forest floor into a dim green-tinged twilight. The weighted silence he had felt on the drive-in returned, 100 times more potent. It pressed in on his ears, a physical weight. He checked his compass and started walking north. The forest floor was a thick carpet of damp leaves and moss, which muffled his footsteps, making him feel like a ghost gliding through a dead world. The trees were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. He saw strange symbols carved into the bark of some of the oaks, the same closed-eye design he had seen on the headboard of his bed. They were old, the cuts weathered and dark, almost healed over. They were like ancient sleeping eyes, watching him as he passed. After walking for about 20 minutes, he saw the first one. It was a small wooden doll, identical to the one from his windowsill, hanging by a piece of twine from a low-hanging branch. Its featureless face and fixed smile seemed both innocent and deeply malevolent. He stopped, his blood running cold. Was it a warning? A marker? He pushed on, his unease growing with every step. He soon saw another, and then another. They were placed sporadically, some hanging from branches, others propped in the hollows of trees, and others sitting on moss-covered stones. They seemed to form a crude winding path, leading him deeper and deeper into the woods. He was no longer following his compass. He was following the dolls. He knew it was a terrible idea and that he was walking into a trap, but he could not stop. His journalistic instincts, the part of him that craved the truth above all else, were in control. The whispers started again. They were fainter than they had been in his room, as elusive as the breeze he could not feel. They came from all around him, from the rustling leaves, from the creaking branches, from the very air itself. A child's giggle, quickly cut off. A soft, mournful sigh. A single, sibilant word he could not quite understand, repeated over and over. He stopped, holding his breath, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds were everywhere and nowhere at once. The woods were alive, and they were speaking to him. He clutched the digital recorder in his pocket, his thumb hovering over the record button. But what would he be recording? The wind, his own ragged breathing, the descent of his own mind into madness. He pressed on, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He found the clearing an hour later. It was a sudden, unnatural break in the dense forest, a perfect circle where the trees simply stopped, their edges forming a neat, unbroken wall around a space of about 100 feet in diameter. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins of the schoolhouse. It was exactly as he had dreamed, a single-room wooden structure, its roof long since collapsed, leaving its skeletal rafters exposed to the sky like the ribs of a decaying carcass. The walls were still standing, but they sagged inwards, covered in a thick shroud of ivy. The windows were gaping holes, the glass gone, like vacant eyes staring out at the silent woods. A rusted swing set stood nearby, one of its swings hanging by a single chain, swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. The place radiated a palpable aura of sorrow and neglect. It was a tomb. Elias walked slowly into the clearing, feeling 100 unseen eyes on his back. The whispering grew stronger here, more defined. He could almost make out the rise and fall of children's voices, not speaking words, but humming a simple, discordant melody. It was a tune of profound sadness, a lullaby for the dead. He approached the schoolhouse, his footsteps loud on the leaf-strewn ground. The front door was gone, leaving a dark rectangular moor. He hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get out of these woods and never look back. But the archivist in him, the man who had travelled 1,000 miles for this story, took one last, shuddering breath and stepped inside. The interior was a scene of arrested decay. Rotting floorboards lay over a foundation of packed earth. Rows of small wooden desks, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, were still arranged in neat rows facing the front of the room. A large chalkboard still hung on the far wall, and on it, faint but still legible under a film of dust, was a single, childishly scrawled word: run. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, a jolt of pure terror. This was real. Something had happened here. Something terrible. He moved deeper into the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He saw a small, rusted lunch pail lying on its side in a corner. He saw a child's leather shoe, its laces still tied, half buried in the dirt. And on the teacher's desk at the front of the room he saw them. A collection of the wooden dolls. There were at least 24, arranged in a neat semicircle, all facing the doorway, all facing him. They sat like a silent miniature congregation, their painted smiles all seeming to widen in the dim light. In the center of the semicircle was a larger doll, crudely carved to look like a woman, with a scrap of black cloth for a dress, a teacher and her silent, watchful students. It was then that he heard a new sound, cutting through the humming whispers. It was the distinct rhythmic creak of rusted metal. He spun around, his flashlight beams slicing through the darkness of the doorway. The swing outside, the one that had been swaying gently, was now moving back and forth with more force, as if someone had just leapt from the seat. It swung higher and higher, its creaking a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. He backed away from the dolls, stumbling over a fallen desk. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him in the small, ruined room. They were no longer just humming. He could hear words, fragments of words, children's voices calling out in the dark. He cannot see. It is so dark. The teacher lied. He is coming. A cold spot formed in the center of the room, a pocket of icy air that raised goosebumps on his arms. He could feel a presence, a concentration of the sorrow and fear that saturated this place. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye, a small, fleeting shape that vanished when he tried to look at it directly. He had to get out. He bolted from the schoolhouse, not looking back, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged sobs. He ran across the clearing and plunged back into the trees, ignoring the branches that whipped at his face and clawed at his clothes. The whispers followed him, rising in volume, no longer just sad but angry. The humming became a shriek. The giggles became mocking laughter. He could hear the sound of small feet running behind him, keeping pace with him just out of sight, the soft patter of shoes on the dead leaves. He ran blindly, all sense of direction gone, driven only by a terror so profound it threatened to stop his heart. He stumbled, fell, and scrambled back to his feet, mud and leaves clinging to his clothes. The forest had transformed from a place of silent dread to one of active, malevolent pursuit. He felt hands grasping for him, small, cold fingers brushing against the back of his neck. Finally, through the trees, he saw it, the back of the inn. He burst from the woods and collapsed onto the damp grass, gasping for air, his body shaking uncontrollably. He lay there for a long time, the sounds of the forest slowly receding, the angry whispers fading back into the oppressive silence. When he finally found the strength to stand, dusk was beginning to settle. The mists were rolling in, shrouding the town in their grey embrace. He stumbled to the inn's back door and let himself in, locking it behind him. He climbed the stairs to his room on trembling legs, his mind a maelstrom of terror. He locked his room door, throwing the deadbolt and wedging the chair back under the knob. He went to the window, needing to see something normal, something other than the inside of this haunted inn. He looked down at the street below. It was empty, save for a single figure. It was Martha, the innkeeper. She was standing across the street, partially obscured by the mist, looking directly up at his window. Her face was a pale oval in the gathering gloom, her expression utterly blank, her eyes as empty and watchful as the deers on the road. She just stood there, a silent sentinel in the twilight, watching him. He knew then that the doors of the inn were not meant to keep the dangers of the woods out. They were meant to keep him in. The sight of Martha standing in the mist, a statue carved from shadow and bone, broke something in Elias Thorne. The fragile membrane of scholarly detachment he had maintained, the idea that he was an observer and not a participant, ruptured completely. He was not studying a story. He was in it. He was a character in a tale whose ending he was beginning to dread. He stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat, and stared at the door. The simple lock and the flimsy chair he had propped against it seemed like a child's defense against a tidal wave. The inn was not a sanctuary, it was a cage, and she was one of the keepers. He spent another night in the cold embrace of terror, but this time it was different. The whispers returned as the last of the light died, but they were no longer a vague, atmospheric chorus. They had a new quality, a focus, an intimacy. They were closer. They sounded as if they were coming from inside the room itself. He would hear a soft sigh from the corner where the wardrobe stood, a rustle of cloth from the foot of the bed, a single sharp intake of breath right behind his ear. He would spin around, flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc through the darkness, and find nothing, only the stale air and the oppressive silence that rushed in to fill the void left by the sound. He did not dare sleep. He sat at the small desk, his laptop open, the glow of the screen a small island of order in a sea of encroaching chaos. He had no internet connection. The Wi-Fi network Martha had given him the password for, Weary Dragon, had vanished. He was not surprised. It was another wall being built around him. He worked offline, his fingers flying across the keyboard, not out of academic diligence, but out of a desperate need to impose logic on the illogical. He wrote down everything he had seen: the deer, the townspeople's empty eyes, the mutilated records, the schoolhouse, the dolls, the word on the chalkboard. He tried to construct a timeline, a narrative, a theory. He was trying to solve a puzzle while the puzzle pieces themselves were crawling off the table. He kept his digital recorder running on the desk, its small red light a defiant eye against the dark. He listened back to the recordings from the schoolhouse. He had captured it. Beneath the sound of his own ragged breathing and the crunch of his footsteps, there was something else, a low humming frequency that had not been audible to him at the time. When he isolated it and amplified it with his software, it resolved into a series of faint, overlapping tones. It was the discordant, mournful lullaby he had heard. It was real. The sound sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. This was not a hallucination. At one point, a new sound began, a soft rhythmic scratching. It came from the wall behind the headboard of the bed. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound of a fingernail being dragged through old wood. He imagined a small child trapped on the other side of the wall, idly trying to claw its way through. The sound went on for nearly an hour, a maddening, patient torment that frayed his nerves to the breaking point. Morning brought no relief, only a different flavor of fear. The grey light revealed a room that was subtly wrong. The single book he had left on his nightstand was now on the floor. The pen that had been on his desk was now under the chair. Small, insignificant changes that screened a single, terrifying message. We were here. We can get in whenever we want. The locks mean nothing. He did not touch the breakfast tray left outside his door. The thought of eating, of taking anything from these people, felt like a form of surrender. Hunger was a distant secondary concern to the all-consuming need to understand, to find a weapon against the suffocating dread. He decided to search the room, not for a way out, but for a clue, for anything that could tell him what he was up against. The people of this town were silent, but the place itself seemed to be groaning under the weight of its secrets. Perhaps it had left traces. He started with the wardrobe. It was a heavy, dark wood piece that smelled of cedar and thyme. He emptied his few clothes onto the bed and ran his hands along the interior panels. The back panel felt loose. He pushed and it shifted slightly. His heart hammered. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel, attached by old rusted clips, came away with a groan of protest. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. Inside that cavity was a book. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained by damp. He took it to the desk, his hands trembling. The pages were brittle. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The handwriting was a frantic, spidery scrawl, the words packed tightly together, as if the author was afraid of running out of paper or time. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1978. My name is Arthur Pembroke. I am a journalist. I came to Oakhaven following a lead on a story about a town that had fallen off the map. I thought it was a quaint human interest piece. God, I was a fool. I am staying in room 4 of the inn. The same room, I suspect, they put all outsiders in. This room is a cage. This town is a tomb. Elias read on, his blood turning to ice. Pembroke's story was a horrifying echo of his own. The silent townspeople, the cryptic warnings, the feeling of being watched. He too had been drawn to the woods, to the ruins of the schoolhouse. His descriptions were more visceral, less academic than Elias's own notes. The woods do not just watch, they think. They have a will, a malevolent, ancient intelligence. I saw the dolls. They are not decorations, they are eyes, they are anchors. Each one is a little piece of a soul, trapped here as a sentinel. The children's souls. Elias's breath hitched. He read faster, the scrawled words painting a picture of a man's descent into madness, or into a truth far worse than madness. It was the teacher. Her name was Adeline. The town records are gone, but the old ones, they still remember. They will not speak her name aloud. She came in the late 1880s. She was different. She loved the children, they said, too much. She saw the town as a dead end, a place where their light would be extinguished by a life of hardship and obscurity. She believed the woods offered a different path, a way to preserve them, to keep them young and innocent forever. She made a pact, not with a demon, not with the devil, with the woods themselves, with the ancient, hungry thing that sleeps in the heart of this forest. She promised it the children, their energy, their light. In return, the woods would grant them a form of immortality. They would not age, not suffer, not die. They would be silent and eternal. The townspeople did not understand until it was too late. One day, the schoolhouse was just empty. The children were gone, all of them. They searched for weeks. They found nothing, no bodies, no tracks, just the first of the dolls hanging from the trees, and then the whispers began. The parents, driven mad by grief, started to hear their children's voices in the wind. At night, they would see small shapes flitting at the edge of their vision. The children had not left. They were just changed. They were part of the woods now, and the woods were part of them. The last few entries were nearly illegible, the handwriting shaky and panicked. Adeline never left. The townsfolk say she is still in the schoolhouse, the eternal teacher of her silent class, a shepherdess of echoes. She is the gatekeeper. She is the one who directs their anger. The whispers are in my head now. They know my name. They are calling for me to come out and play. They scratch at the walls. They move things in my room when I am not looking. I saw a face in the window last night, small, pale, with dark empty holes sagged for eyes. It is the dolls. They are a conduit. She sees through them. The one they put on my windowsill. It was an invitation to the lesson. I refused. Now the lesson is coming to me. They do not want me to leave. I know too much. No one who knows the truth is allowed to leave Oakhaven. The final entry was a single, terrifying sentence. I can hear them at the door. Oh God, they are not whispering anymore. The journal ended there. Elias slammed it shut, his mind reeling. This was not a legend. It was a history, a record of a recurring nightmare. Arthur Pembroke had been here, in this very room, and he had died here. The town had not just hidden the story, they had buried the evidence, body and all, and now it was his turn. He felt a surge of defiant anger cut through the fear. He would not end up like Pembroke. He was not a victim. He was a scholar. He had to get this story out. He had the journal. He had the recordings. He had his own notes. It was evidence. He just needed to escape. His mind raced, formulating a plan. He could not just walk out the front door. Martha, the storekeeper, the whole town would be waiting. He had to go at night. The woods were terrifying, but they were his only chance. He could not go back the way he came. He had to find another way out of the valley. He remembered the property map he had taken from the town hall. He pulled it from his jacket pocket and spread it on the desk. There was a creek that ran north, away from the town, eventually feeding into a larger river outside the valley. If he could follow that creek, he might be able to get clear of the town's influence, of the wood's suffocating reach. It was a slim hope, but it was all he had. He spent the rest of the day preparing, his fear channeled into a feverish, focused energy. He packed a small bag with the journal, his recorder, his laptop, and the 2 bottles of water he had bought. He would leave everything else. He had to travel light. He would wait until after midnight, when the town was at its deepest slumber, and slip out the back. As dusk fell, he ate the cold, congealed stew from the breakfast tray, forcing himself to swallow every bite. He needed the energy. As he ate, he watched the window. The woods turned from a wall of green to a wall of solid black. The air in the room grew cold. The whispers began, low and insidious. They sounded different tonight. They sounded excited. He sat at the desk, his packed bag at his feet, and waited for the hours to pass. The scratching on the wall started again, but this time it was faster, more frantic. It sounded like a dozen small animals trying to claw their way in. He tried to ignore it. He focused on the map, on his escape route. Around 11 o'clock, a new sound began. It came from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a small ball being bounced against the wooden floor. It was slow, patient. It started at the far end of the hall and was getting closer. Elias's blood ran cold. He held his breath, straining to hear over the frantic beating of his own heart. Thump, thump. It was right outside his door. It stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The scratching in the walls ceased. The whispers died. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Elias stared at the door, at the small gap underneath. A shadow fell across the threshold. Someone was standing there. He watched, paralyzed with a terror so pure it felt like his soul was trying to leave his body. Then, from under the door, a small, white object rolled slowly into the room. It came to a stop near the foot of his desk. It was a marble, an old-fashioned glass cat's eye marble. His gaze was fixed on it. It was a simple, innocent object, a child's toy. But in the context of this room, of this town, it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was a message. It was a token. It was proof that the barrier between his world and theirs had been breached. Then he heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however short that might be. It came from the other side of the door, a small, clear voice. It was not a whisper. It was not an echo. It was the voice of a little girl, clear as a bell. "Can we come in now?" it asked, a note of sweet, chilling patience in its tone. "Teacher says it is time for the lesson." The sound was trapped in his throat, a knot of pure, undiluted horror. He watched as the doorknob, the old brass knob he had stared at for 2 days, began to turn. It moved slowly, deliberately, with a smooth, inexorable motion that defied the chair he had wedged beneath it. The chair began to scrape against the wooden floor, pushed back by an unseen, unstoppable force. The lesson was starting. And he was the student. The sound of the turning doorknob was the sound of the world ending. Elias was frozen, a statue of terror, his eyes locked on the slow, impossible rotation. The chair he had wedged under the knob, his last pathetic symbol of defiance, screeched against the floorboards, its legs juddering as a strength far beyond the physical pushed from the other side. The wood of the chair began to groan, the fibers splintering under the immense silent pressure. With a final, sharp crack, one of the legs snapped, and the chair was thrown back, tumbling into the room as the door swung silently inward. The hallway beyond was dark, a black throat leading into the heart of the inn. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was a held breath, a drawn bowstring. Then they began to emerge from the darkness. There were 3 of them, 3 small figures, stepping over the threshold into the dim light of his room. They were children, perhaps between the ages of 7 and 10, but they were a horrifying parody of childhood. Their skin was the pale, luminous white of fungus that grows in the dark, stretched tight over their small bones. They wore simple, homespun clothes from another century, now tattered and stained with earth. They moved with an unnatural grace, a fluid, gliding motion as if their feet were not quite touching the floor. But it was their faces that shattered Elias's sanity. They were smooth, placid, and utterly devoid of emotion. Their lips were thin, colourless lines. They had no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and their eyes were not eyes at all. They were dark, hollow pits, voids of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light from the room. They were the eyes of the deer, the eyes of the townspeople, the eyes of the dolls, but these were the source, the original emptiness. They stopped just inside the room, standing in a small, silent line, their hollow gaze fixed on him. They did not breathe, they did not blink. They simply stood and watched, their presence a crushing weight that sucked the air from the room and filled it with a cold that was not of the earth. The whispers had stopped. There was only the ringing in Elias's ears and the frantic, useless beating of his own heart. The girl who had spoken, the one with the clear, bell-like voice, stood in the centre, a tattered ribbon still tied in her lank, dark hair. She tilted her head, a slow, curious gesture that was utterly inhuman. The spell of paralysis broke. A surge of pure animal survival instinct flooded Elias's body. This was not a negotiation. This was not a confrontation. This was an extermination. He was an insect, and they had lifted the rock he was hiding under. He did not scream. He did not make a sound. In one explosive movement, he grabbed the strap of his bag from the floor, slung it over his shoulder, and launched himself not at the door, but at the window. He used the desk as a springboard, his hands slamming down on its surface as he vaulted towards the glass. The impact was a starburst of pain and sound. The old, brittle pane of glass shattered, and he was through, tumbling out into the cold night air. The fall felt like it lasted an eternity. He had a fleeting, surreal impression of the inn falling away, of the misty streetlights, of the dark, silent houses. He twisted in the air, trying to roll, and hit the ground with a jarring, brutal impact that stole his breath and sent a bolt of white-hot agony up his right leg. He lay on the damp, cold grass for a second, gasping, his vision swimming. His ankle screamed in protest. Sprained, maybe broken. He did not care. He pushed himself up, his teeth gritted against the pane. He looked up at the jagged black hole of his window. The 3 children were standing there, looking down at him, their pale faces like 3 small, predatory moons. They were not angry. They were not surprised. They were simply watching the lesson unfold. He scrambled to his feet, putting as little weight as possible on his injured ankle, and began to run. It was a clumsy, lurching hobble, a caricature of flight, but it was the best he could do. He ran down the empty main street, the weak, yellow glow of the street lamps casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for him. The town was utterly silent. There were no lights in the windows, no sounds from the houses. However, he felt eyes on him from every darkened pane of glass, from every deep shadow on every listing porch. The entire town was a silent witness to his desperate, pathetic flight. He saw a figure standing in the doorway of the general store, a thick, barrel-chested silhouette. The storekeeper. He did not move. He did not call out. He just watched. Ahead, he saw Martha, a wraith in the mist, standing on the porch of the inn, her face turned towards him, a silent observer of his fate. He reached the edge of town, his lungs burning, the pain in his ankle a steady, throbbing fire. The manicured yards gave way to the tangled, dark moor of the forest. This was it, the point of no return. He plunged into the trees without a second's hesitation. The darkness was immediate and absolute, a physical thing that smothered the senses. He stumbled, catching himself on the rough bark of a tree. He could not see a thing. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the small, cold metal of his flashlight. He switched it on. The beam cut a narrow, trembling tunnel through the suffocating blackness. It revealed a world of gnarled, watching trees, of skeletal branches draped in moss, of a thick, wet carpet of dead leaves underfoot. He checked his compass, the needle wavering wildly for a moment before settling. North. He had to go north. He had to find the creek. He pushed deeper into the woods, his flashlight beam bobbing crazily with his limping gait. The whispers started again, but they were different now. They were no longer mournful or distant. They were sharp, close, and full of a cold, predatory glee. They were the whispers of hunters closing in on their prey. He heard them all around him. A giggle to his left, a sharp, sibilant hush to his right. He heard his name, spoken in a dozen different childish voices, drawn out and mocking. Elias. The dolls were everywhere. His light would catch them hanging from branches, their painted smiles seeming to twist in the moving beam. He would see them propped against trees just at the edge of his vision. He swore he saw their small wooden heads turn to follow him as he passed. They were the eyes of the forest, and they were all open, all watching. He felt a maddening sense of disorientation. The woods seemed to shift and writhe around him. Trees that were a dozen feet away one moment would suddenly be right in his path. The ground, which should have been sloping down towards the creek, felt like it was tilting upwards. He kept checking the compass, but he had the terrifying feeling that north was no longer a fixed point. Then he heard it, the sound of running water. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He fought his way through a thicket of thorns that tore at his clothes and skin and stumbled out onto a low, muddy bank. Below him was the creek. It was wider than he'd expected, a ribbon of black, fast-moving water that reflected the darkness of the sky. It was his guide, his only way out. He did not hesitate. He slid down the bank, the mud sucking at his shoes, and plunged into the icy water. The cold was a physical blow, so intense it drove the air from his lungs. It shot up his legs, a clean, sharp pain that momentarily eclipsed the throbbing agony in his ankle. He pushed off the bottom, the water coming up to his waist, and began to move, half wading, half swimming with the current. The freezing water was a torment, but it was a real, physical torment. It was better than the phantom touches and whispering voices of the woods. He stayed in the center of the creek, the flashlight held high in one hand, his bag clutched tightly in the other. He was exposed, but he felt safer in the water than he did on the banks. The trees crowded the edges of the creek, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers, but they could not touch him here. The pursuit did not stop. He could hear them on both sides of the creek now, keeping pace with him. He heard the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves. He would swing his flashlight beam towards the sound and see nothing but the dense, dark wall of the forest. But sometimes he would see a flicker of movement, a small, pale shape darting behind a tree. A pair of dark eyes, glowing faintly for a second before vanishing. They were flanking him, herding him. They were not in a hurry. The lesson was long, and the night was young. He lost all track of time. It could have been an hour, it could have been 4. His body was numb with cold, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. The pain in his ankle had settled into a deep, grinding ache. His flashlight beam began to flicker, the batteries dying. Each time it faltered, his heart seized with a fresh wave of panic. To be left in the total darkness of this place, with them so close, was a thought he could not bear. He found a small alcove in the creek bank, where a large, mossy boulder offered a tiny bit of shelter from the main current. He had to rest. just for a minute. He dragged himself out of the water, his body shaking violently, and huddled behind the rock. He switched off his failing flashlight to conserve its power. The darkness that crashed down on him was absolute. He sat there, shivering, listening. The woods were quiet for the first time. The whispers had faded. The sound of their pursuit had ceased. There was only the sound of the rushing water and his own ragged breathing. A sliver of hope, treacherous and foolish, worked its way into his heart. Had he lost them? Had the water hidden his trail? He fumbled in his bag, his numb fingers finding the cold leather of Pembroke's journal. He clutched it like a holy relic. The truth was in his hands. He had to survive. He had to tell their story. That is when he heard the splash. It was not a loud sound. It was a soft, gentle splash coming from a few yards downstream. The sound of a small stone being dropped into the water. Then another, and another, closer this time. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He knew what it was. They were playing. They were toying with him. He fumbled for his flashlight, his thumb slipping on the switch. He finally got it on. The beam was weak now, a sickly yellow, but it was enough. He pointed it downstream, and he saw her. It was the girl with the ribbon in her hair. She was standing in the middle of the creek, the black water swirling around her waist. She was perfectly still, her pale face turned towards him, her hollow eyes fixed on his hiding place. She was not wet. The water seemed to flow around her without touching her. She held a small, white stone in her hand. She tilted her head, that same slow, unnatural gesture. Then she smiled. It was the first expression he had seen on any of them. It was a thin, tight smile that did not reach her empty eyes, a smile of pure, cold malice. She raised her hand and dropped the stone into the water. Splash! Then, from the bank just above his head, he heard a soft, clear giggle. Elias scrambled back, away from the sound, his injured ankle giving way. He fell back into the freezing creek as his flashlight finally gave out, plunging him into a nightmare of absolute darkness, the sound of a little girl's laughter echoing from the bank above, and the sight of a cold, pale smile burned forever into his mind. Darkness, absolute and total. Elias was submerged in a world without light, a sensory deprivation tank of freezing water and suffocating blackness. The laughter of the girl on the bank, a sound like tiny shattering icicles, echoed in his ears, indistinguishable from the rushing of the creek and the frantic roaring pulse in his own head. He flailed, his hands finding no purchase, his injured ankle sending shards of agony up his leg with every panicked kick. The current was a living thing, a cold, muscular serpent coiling around him, trying to pull him under, to drag him into the silent, waiting earth. He broke the surface, gasping, sputtering, his lungs burning from the shock of the cold. He was blind. The world was a chaotic symphony of sound and sensation, but his eyes registered nothing but a uniform. Impenetrable black, he was a nerve ending, raw and exposed, adrift in a hostile universe. "He is cold," a voice said. It was a little boy's voice, seeming to come from inches away. Right beside his ear in the churning water, teacher said, "The cold makes them listen." "Is it time for the lesson now?" another voice asked. The girl with the ribbon. She was somewhere in front of him, her voice a clear, calm point in the chaos. He tried to swim, to move away from the voices, but his limbs were heavy, disobedient logs, his movements clumsy and useless against the current. He was losing heat, losing strength. The initial shock was giving way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The terror was still there, a high, thin wire of adrenaline, but it was being drowned in a sea of encroaching numbness. "The lesson is always now," the girl's voice replied, patient and serene. "It never stops." Then the whispers returned, but they were transformed. They were no longer a sibilant, atmospheric chorus. They were inside his head. They were articulate, focused, and terrifyingly intimate. They did not speak of the woods or of forgotten sorrows. They spoke of him, Elias Thorne. A soft voice whispered, weaving through the sound of the rushing water. "The man who digs up bones. You thought you could put our story in one of your little boxes. Label it. File it away." He left his wife. Another voice giggled, a cruel, childish sound. He told her it was for work. He told her he would be back. He lied. He always lies. Elias's heart seized. How could they know that? The thought was a fresh violation, a peeling back of his skin to expose the soft, secret parts of his life. He saw his wife's face in the darkness, her eyes pleading with him not to go, not to chase another ghost. The memory was a fresh stab of guilt, a weakness they had found and were now gleefully exploiting. "Arthur Pembroke sat where you sat," the whispers continued, a symphony of small, cold voices. "He read what you read. He ran where you run. His bones are part of the soil now. His truth is a whisper the trees tell each other when they are bored." They were stripping him bare, dismantling his identity piece by piece. He was not a scholar. He was a failed husband. He was not a discoverer of truth. He was a fool, following the footsteps of a dead man. The waterlogged journal in his bag, his precious evidence, suddenly felt like a tombstone he was carrying on his own back. He felt a small, cold hand brush against his cheek. He jerked back with a strangled cry, but another hand grasped his arm, its grip surprisingly strong. He felt more of them closing in around him in the water, their touch light but firm, guiding him, stopping his frantic struggles. They were not trying to drown him. They were holding him, presenting him. The temperature dropped. The rushing water, the night air, the very stones on the creek bed seemed to lose their last vestiges of warmth, plunging to a depth of cold that was unnatural. A new silence fell, a profound hush that swallowed the sound of the creek and the whispers of the children. It was a silence of absolute authority, and in that silence a new voice spoke. It was not a child's voice. It was a woman. It was calm, measured, and resonant with an ageless power. It did not come from a single point in space, but seemed to emanate from the trees, the water, and the darkness itself. It was the voice of the woods. It was the voice of the teacher. "You are a disruptive student, Mr. Thorne." The voice was not angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. It was the voice of a stern headmistress, addressing a particularly difficult and slow-witted pupil. "You have run all over the school grounds," the voice of Adeline continued. a cold, clear presence that vibrated in his very bones. You have refused to listen. You have failed to grasp the simplicity of the lesson. Elias stopped struggling, held fast by the small, cold hands, floating in the black water. He was in the presence of the source, the architect of this nightmare. All his academic theories, his search for rational explanations, evaporated in the face of this ancient, undeniable power. What do you want? He stammered, his voice a pathetic croak. Want. The voice was tinged with something like amusement. I want what every teacher wants. For my children to be safe, to be preserved. This world you come from, Mr. Thorne, it is a cruel, ugly place. It burns bright and hot, and it turns children to ash. It steals their innocence, grinds their dreams into dust, and then discards their old, tired bodies. I would not allow that for my pupils. He saw it then, in his mind's eye, a vision projected into his skull. He saw Oakhaven in the 1880s, a hard, unforgiving place. He saw children with old, weary faces, their hands chapped from labour, their futures a short, straight line from the schoolhouse to the sawmill or the farm, and then to the cold, hard ground. I offered them a gift, Adeline's voice explained, its calm reason more terrifying than any shriek. A different path. I made a covenant with the heart of this place, an intelligence older than any of your fleeting cities. I offered it their light, their energy, to nurture it. In return, it offered them sanctuary, an eternity of childhood, no pain, no aging, no death, only the quiet, gentle turning of the seasons, forever and ever. They are not dead, Mr. Thorne. They are saved. The small hands holding him tightened their grip, not with malice, but with an earnest, pleading pressure. She saved us, the whispers echoed in his mind, full of a chilling, genuine gratitude. The world cannot hurt us any more. You see their bodies as grotesque, the teacher continued, her voice dissecting his fear with surgical precision. You see their eyes as empty, but they are not empty. They are full. They are full of the quiet wisdom of the trees, the patience of the stone. They are free from the frantic, meaningless desires that drive you. They are at peace. The cold was seeping into his core now. His shivering had almost stopped, replaced by a dangerous lethargy. It would be so easy to give in, to stop fighting, to let the cold take him, to be at peace. The thought was a seductive poison. Your struggle is pointless, Adeline's voice said, sensing his weakening resolve. It became softer, almost gentle. Your fear is exhausting. You do not have to run anymore. You can rest now. You have learned so much. You understand the truth. Why not stay and become part of it? We have a place for you. You can watch with us. You can be silent. You can be at peace. Just let go, Mr. Thorne. The lesson is over. It is time to join the class. He felt the current pulling at him more insistently. The hands began to draw him under the surface, a gentle but inexorable pressure. He saw a flash of Arthur Pembroke's final, terrified scribblings. They are not whispering anymore. This was it, the final invitation. Surrender or be broken. Something inside him, a stubborn, irrational ember of defiance, flared. He thought of his wife's face again, not with guilt, but with a fierce, desperate love. He thought of the sun on his face, the taste of coffee, the infuriating, chaotic, beautiful mess of a life he had so carelessly left behind. It was a world of pain and loss, yes, but it was also a world of warmth and connection. This silent, cold eternity they offered was not life. It was a museum exhibit. He had the journal. He had the recordings. He had the truth. It was not a collection of data. It was a warning. It was a testament to the lives that had been stolen here. To surrender was to let Adeline win, to let her monstrous act of love be the final word. No, he gasped, the word tearing from his throat, a raw, ragged sound. He found a final reserve of strength, fueled by pure, unreasoning defiance. You did not save them. You murdered them. The reaction was instantaneous. The gentle pressure became a violent, crushing force. The teacher's calm, disappointed voice vanished, replaced by a silent shriek of pure rage that tore through his mind. The water around him exploded as if a bomb had gone off. The small, pale children were thrown back, and he was dragged under, the creek bed rising up to meet him. The woods erupted. The placid silence was shattered by a cacophony of snapping branches and tearing roots. He felt a searing pain as something sharp and wooden gashed his arm. The children's forms, illuminated by some internal spectral light, reappeared around him, but they were changed. Their placid faces were gone, twisted into primitive masks of fury. Their hollow eyes glowed with a faint red light. Their mouths opened in silent screams, revealing rows of small, sharp, needle-like teeth. This was the truth beneath the placid surface. This was the caged, furious energy of stolen lives. He was being torn apart. The water pulled him down while unseen forces in the woods lashed at him from the banks. He saw fragmented images flicker before his eyes. A little boy's terror as the teacher led him away from the path. A girl's confusion as the woods grew dark around her. The collective, dawning horror of the children as they realized this was not a game. He was experiencing their last moments, the raw terror of their sacrifice. In the midst of the violent, chaotic assault, he saw his chance. The rage was undirected, a wild, lashing storm. Their focus was gone. He kicked out with his good leg, his foot connecting with something solid in the churning water. He pushed, propelling himself sideways, away from the center of the vortex. He clawed his way through the mud and roots of the opposite bank, hauling his broken, bleeding body from the water. He scrambled up the bank, his hands raw, his ankles screaming. He did not look back. The sound of the enraged forest was at his heels, a wave of pure hatred that he could feel on his skin. He pushed through a final line of grasping thorns and fell forward, landing hard on a surface that was not soft earth. It was an old logging trail, faintly visible in the pre-dawn gloom. It was a straight, unnatural scar through the writhing ancient forest. It was a path made by the world outside, a path leading away. With a final, desperate sob, he pushed himself to his feet and began to run, his body a symphony of pain, but his will a single, focused point of steel. The shrieking of the children and the silent, cold rage of their teacher pursued him, but the sound seemed, for the first time, to be falling behind. He was a wounded animal who had escaped the heart of the trap. He was not safe. He was far from safe. But as the first faint grey hint of dawn began to bleed through the canopy of the enraged forest ahead, he was for the first time since entering Oakhaven free. The logging trail was a line of salvation drawn through a world of damnation. It was a promise that the twisted, intelligent malevolence of Oakhaven's woods had a boundary. Elias ran. He was no longer a man. He was a vessel of pure forward motion. Pain was a constant, a white-hot static that filled his entire being, but it was a distant signal. The immediate reality was the crunch of gravel under his good foot, the ragged, tearing gasp of his own breath, and the blessed, undeniable fact that the path beneath him was straight. Behind him, the forest seethed. He did not look back, but he could feel its fury, a palpable pressure on his spine. The air itself seemed to resist his passage, thick with a hatred that had been festering for over a century. The cacophony of snapping branches and silent psychic screams began to fade, not because their anger was abating, but because he was finally blessedly moving out of its range. The invisible leash that had held him in the valley was stretching, fraying, threatening to snap. The sky bled from black to a bruised purple, then to a sickly grey. The light grew, not with the warmth of a hopeful dawn, but with the flat, revealing glare of an interrogation lamp. It exposed the full extent of his ruin. His clothes were shredded and caked in mud and blood. A deep, clean gash from a lashing root wept blood down his left forearm. His right ankle was a swollen, misshapen lump that screamed with every lurching step. He was a portrait of a man who had been dragged through hell. He ran for what felt like an eternity. The gnarled, moss-draped sentinels of Oakhaven's heartwood gradually gave way to younger, straighter trees. Birch and pine began to appear among the ancient oaks. The undergrowth thinned. He could see more than 10 feet in front of him. The world was slowly returning to its normal, chaotic, non-sentient state. He stumbled, his body finally reaching its absolute limit. He fell to his knees on the gravel trail, his head hanging, every muscle screaming in protest. The silence was profound. There were no whispers, no giggles, no patient, disappointed voice of a long-dead teacher. There was only the sound of the wind in the pines and the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart. He was alone. The thought was both a relief and a new kind of terror. After a few minutes, he forced himself back up. He could not stop, not yet. He limped on, his pace now a slow, agonizing shuffle. The sun finally broke through the canopy, and the warmth on his face was so alien, so exquisitely normal, that it brought tears to his eyes. He wept, not from fear or pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of feeling the sun again. And then he heard it, a low, rhythmic hum. It was a sound he had not heard in days, a sound he had forgotten existed, the sound of tires on asphalt. He pushed through a final screen of ferns and stumbled out of the forest, blinking in the bright morning light. He was standing on the shoulder of a two-lane highway. It was cracked and faded, but it was a testament to the world he had left behind. Across the road, a power line, a single, sagging wire, ran parallel, humming with the contained energy of civilization. He had made it. He was out. He saw the truck coming, a big red semi, shimmering in the distance. He did not have the strength to wave his arms. He simply stood there, a ragged spectre on the side of the road, and waited. The truck slowed, the hiss of its air brakes a mechanical sigh of pity. It pulled over 100 feet past him. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a flannel shirt and a greasy baseball cap leaned out, his face a mask of disbelief. "Jesus Christ, son," the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "What the hell happened to you?" The question broke the dam. The strength that had carried Elias through the night, the adrenaline and the terror, and the sheer stubborn will to live, all of it dissolved in an instant. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the warm, solid asphalt of the highway. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the trucker's horrified face as he ran towards him. He woke to the smell of antiseptic and the soft rhythmic beep of a machine. He was in a bed with clean white sheets. A tube was taped to the back of his hand. Sunlight, filtered through beige blinds, filled the room with a gentle, hazy light. For a moment, he felt a profound sense of peace. It was over. He was safe. A nurse came in, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes. She told him he was in a regional hospital in a town called Northwood, 60 miles from where the trucker had found him. He had a severely sprained and fractured ankle, a concussion, dozens of lacerations, and a dangerous case of hypothermia. He had been unconscious for nearly a day. Later, 2 state troopers came to his room. They were polite, professional, their faces carefully neutral. They listened patiently as he told his story. He left nothing out: the silent town, the mutilated records, Pembroke's journal, the schoolhouse, Adeline, the children with the hollow eyes. He knew how it sounded. He could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the professional patience hardening into a carefully concealed skepticism. "So you are saying," the older trooper, a man named Harris, said, his pen hovering over his notepad, "that the residents of this town, Oakhaven, held you against your will, and you were then pursued through the woods by ghosts." "They were not just ghosts," Elias said, his voice raspy. "They were real. The town's people. They are part of it. They are guardians. They protect the secret. We will look into it, Mr. Thorne," the younger trooper said, a little too quickly. "We sent a patrol car down that logging trail where you were found. It is an old, washed-out road, ends in a rock slide about 5 miles in. There is no town back there. There has not been for decades, according to our maps." "No," Elias insisted, trying to sit up, a bolt of pain shooting through his ankle. "It is there. It is hidden. It is in a valley. You have to." "We will check it out," Harris repeated, his voice calm and placating, the voice one uses on a delirious patient. "You get some rest. We will talk again when you are feeling better." They were humoring him. They thought he was a hiker who had gotten lost, fallen, hit his head, and hallucinated the whole thing. The cuts. An animal attack. A badger, maybe. The terror. A product of his concussion. "Wait," Elias called out as they reached the door. "The evidence. My bag. I have proof." The younger trooper retrieved his mud-stained bag from a corner of the room. Elias's hands trembled as he unzipped it. His laptop was a wreck. The screen cracked and the case warped, likely from his fall from the inn window. But the journal and the recorder were there. "This," he said, pulling out the leather-bound journal. "This is the journal of Arthur Pembroke, a journalist who disappeared there in 1978. It explains everything." He opened it, and his blood turned to ice. The pages were blank, every single one. The rusty brown ink, the frantic spidery scrawl, all of it was gone. The pages were just empty, warped parchment, smelling faintly of river mud and decay. The water from the creek had washed away the words, but Elias knew this was no natural process. Adeline had reached out and erased her history. There is nothing here," Trooper Harris said, a note of finality in his voice. "The recorder," Elias said, his voice cracking with desperation. He snatched the small digital device. The red light was off, the battery dead, but the memory card was intact. "I recorded them, the whispers, in the schoolhouse." He fumbled with the device, his heart hammering. He found the file and hit play. A hiss of static filled the sterile hospital room. It was the sound of empty air, of nothing. He skipped forward. More static. He played every file he had. Nothing. Just the meaningless electronic shush of a dead recording. The sounds he had captured, the proof of the supernatural, had been wiped clean, leaving only the mundane noise of the world. He looked up at the troopers. The pity in their eyes was worse than any accusation. He was a madman, a teller of impossible tales with a bag full of ruined equipment and a head full of ghosts. They left. He was alone with a truth that no one would ever believe. The silence in the room was heavier than any he had experienced in Oakhaven. It was the silence of absolute, soul-crushing isolation. He spent a week in the hospital, his body slowly knitting itself back together while his mind frayed at the seams. He stopped trying to convince anyone. He answered their questions with monosyllables. He ate his food. He stared at the blank television screen. He was a good, quiet patient. He was learning to be silent. On his last night, a storm rolled in, rattling the windows of his room. He lay in the dark, listening to the rain and the distant roll of thunder, the first storm he had heard in what felt like a lifetime. The nurse gave him a sleeping pill, and for the first time in over a week, a deep, dreamless sleep began to pull him under. He felt the familiar weight of exhaustion, the welcome promise of oblivion. The world was finally, mercifully, fading away. He was just on the edge of unconsciousness when a small, unfamiliar sound cut through the drone of the rain. It was a soft, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, thump. His eyes snapped open. The room was dark, save for the faint ambient glow of a security light from the parking lot outside. His heart, which had finally learned to beat at a normal rhythm, began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was the sound of a small ball being bounced. Slow, patient. It was coming from the hallway, just outside his closed door. It stopped. The silence that followed was a living thing, a presence in the room with him. He stared at the door, at the thin sliver of light underneath. He prayed for the sound of a nurse's squeaking shoes, for a doctor to be paged over the intercom, for any sound from the world of the living. But there was nothing, only the rain, the thunder, and the suffocating, watchful silence. His gaze drifted from the door to the window. The rain was streaming down the glass, distorting the lights from the parking lot into long, wavering streaks. He watched, mesmerized, his breath held tight in his chest, and then he saw it. Sitting on the inside of his windowsill, beside a plastic cup of water, was a small, crudely made doll. It was fashioned from twigs and bits of twine, with a scrap of his own torn shirt for its clothes and 2 small black pebbles for eyes. It was a doll he had never seen before, but he knew, with a certainty that was colder and sharper than any fear he had ever known, exactly where it came from. He was not free. He had not escaped. He had only run from the schoolhouse into a larger, more terrifying classroom. The lesson was not over. It had simply followed him home. Oakhaven was not a place on a map. It was a curse he would carry in his own hollow eyes for the rest of his very, very short life.